Hey, what's up guys, this is Liam or Weagle on your Overwatch, back with a new video. Today we're going to be talking about Blizzardworld. We're going to talk about the entire map this time because it seems to be giving people a lot of problems. This map is either going to go full roll for you or the enemy team is going to destroy you. And I'm going to explain why that happens on every point of the map here, because we have some crazy high ground that needs to be utilized or avoided, and also some choke points that give people some serious problems. So we're going to talk about attack, defense, and all stages of the map. So we're going to start with stage 1, of course, and that is getting through the initial choke point and taking the first point. So there's two places that the enemy team are going to want to defend from, and the same for you when you're on defense. The first is at the choke point, and the second is actually above point A itself before you take the payload. So let's start with the high ground at the choke first. There's two real ways to deal with this. One is removing the threat on the high ground, and the second is actually avoiding it entirely, but we'll go with option A at first. The enemy team are likely sitting up top with an Orisa or a Reinhardt. Now, what you want to do in this situation is either take the space by diving at them but not committing too fully, so that maybe a Hanzo or a Widow or another pick-off character can get some space and do some damage and hopefully get a pick-off. This has actually happened to me a lot of times where my Reinhardt might drop his shield for a second, or the Orisa gets shredded quite quickly and the enemy managed to get a really key pick-off. Another option to deal with this is to actually use a Reinhardt yourself and maybe speed boost on Lucio, which is very important on a lot of the points on this map just because of how deadly these choke points are, and you can speed your team up the stairs on the right hand side and take the fight to the enemy. And although that both of these are okay strategies, either diving them or taking the high ground by force, a lot of the time the enemy is going to have a Junkrat, which really counters both of these strategies quite well. If you're diving into a Junkrat or going through that choke into it, he's just going to build his ult, get free kills, and that's what happens a lot on this point. No Lucio and walk into the spam. Very, very often do I see this happen. Happens on maps like Numbani as well, where people don't know how to deal with that high ground. And we've done a lot of videos on this, and a lot of the time it's either speed at them with force and overwhelm them, or avoid it where you can. And that's a strategy I want to talk about now. So if you take the low ground on the left hand side with your team and speed boost to the point, you can try and do it without Lucio if you want, but really you are going to want one. When you take the point, the enemy then are required to reposition well, and in matchmaking that's not something that usually happens, and you will overwhelm them just because you've got more point presence than them. Now, in an ideal scenario, I'll show you what you need to do, and that's where you back up and reposition your whole team in order to defend the point. You can also take the high ground behind the point that we spoke about before, because this is quite a defensible location too. But you don't have the same luxuries as you did on that first initial choke when the enemy is sitting up top defending, because you are on the point and you have to take it. You can't just go around it this time. So sometimes you may need to take that Farah and Mercy to get behind them, or in some situations I can show you on screen where I will flank around to remove the threat, and even though we may trade out unfavorably, the spawns aren't too bad in our favour. We managed to get people back with speed boost and win out the point from there. This first point is all about that positioning game, and if you don't let the enemy on the defense side have their positioning by just avoiding it entirely, it's going to confuse them most of the time. The only problem you will have is if they're really good at defending that high ground, and in matchmaking you won't see it a lot of the time. But again, they've given you positioning at that point. So if they are all the way on the point, well, your Widow can take up on that other high ground, and you've got some really nice counterplay for this point then, and different ways you can counter the enemy and take all the different angles and fight them. So that's how you take the first point, guys. Avoid where you can, and then let your range DPS do damage where you can as well. Of course, Winston and D.Va are amazing here, particularly if the enemy team are trying to play on point, because they just remove that high ground threat entirely. In terms of characters that you can pick on this point, really it's open. You just have to make sure your team can go together or have enough reliable flankers and solo queue characters to sustain their own lives. You can take Winston, you can take D.Va or Reinhardt and Zarya, but don't dive in like this Winston does on screen now. He does this for the entire game. His team can't keep up with him and he just overextends into our defense. And the thing is, we don't even have a bunker comp here. We have a counter defense dive, but the thing is, if one guy just comes in, we dive him, get a kill and win the point. They've got to wait for the next guy, and that's one thing you really have to avoid. Now the second point is the most get wrecked or do the wrecking point, I think, in the entire game, and there is two reasons for this. The first is the choke point that they have to push the payload through, and the second is because it's kind of like Last Point Junkertown, where it's like a big arena, there's just flanks everywhere and people don't really know how to deal with that. So firstly, we'll show a defense where we are actually holding the enemy at the choke point and at some points even in their spawn. And the reason you can do this is just simply map geometry, and people don't know where to go. There are flanks off to the side, but people don't use them very often. And what happened to us in many games, where we would hold up close to the choke and the enemies come out one by one. And yes, I'm telling you, regroup. Something that people still don't do very well to this day, even at Grandmasters, is just regroup. You've got unlimited health in that spawn point, so make sure you have your whole team before you go out. And if the enemy team are spawn trapping you and you go out with full health and they keep burning their ults, there is no way you won't win a fight because you spawned there and you have unlimited health in there. The enemy team have a much longer run back time than you do. So if you're stuck in this choke point, get your health back and regroup. It makes it so much easier straight away. You could always then just take a Junkrat and a Reinhardt if they're trying to stand on that choke point, and it's a much easier situation to deal with. It's the panic that I think settles in, and just past this choke point are some really nasty accesses to the high ground, and this is the other problem with the second point, where you may be getting held quite heavily. Now this is actually a case of don't play the objective, something that I think people want to scream when they hear, but is actually true. But because of all the memes about pushing the payload over the years, people don't know where to apply that context. If you've pushed the cart halfway down the hill, but you've been really struggling pushing it any further, the chances are it's because the enemy have the high ground or keep going on mad flanks. I can show you footage now of FREEDO doing the same thing. He's playing on defense, and every time the enemy team try to walk down that hill, without a Lucio by the way, he jumps in on Winston, kills the Zen, and jumps back out again. And when the enemy team are running a split comp with some on the high ground and some around the back, that's why you get really held back on this second point, because you let them have that. You just try and get a kill, maybe get a pick and push the objective and the enemy team frag out. You really have to avoid that. The key here is, if you know someone's going on these mad flanks or is on the high ground, you just leave the objective and you get a few kills. That way, when you start pushing the card to the end, as you'll see, no one ever really full holds this second point if it gets down the hill and rolling, because then you have the high ground. You have to use the positioning to your advantage. You stop that guy flanking, you stop the Winston pounce in the back line, which he should never be allowed to do, get a kill and get away alive, but happens all the time. I've seen McCree's even do this. Get around the back when the enemy team push down the hill and get a free kill. Honestly, peel back, leave the objective, kill him, win the high ground, and this is actually a really easy point for the attackers if you follow that philosophy. You just can't get flustered with letting people do what they want to your team. In terms of good heroes to pick on this point, it's quite open like first point is too. Taking the high ground is what's important, so long range DPS characters like Soldier or Widow can be really powerful. Put them up on the high ground on first, put them up on the high ground on second. You just have to make sure you create that access point for them. Don't let the flanker get to them, help your team, ignore the objective, get the positioning that you need, and then get the payload. This game is much more about fragging the enemy than it is moving the objective, and the biggest mistake I see is the panic to try to stop the enemy team get a tick or to try and push it 1 meter further when they could just win the fight and then play the objective with ease. With this being the case, the tanks you're going to want to take on the second point are very similar to the first. It's quite an open field. However, if you do have a Reinhardt and you need to have some high ground control or some peel, maybe you want to have a D.Va with you too. Winston and D.Va as well is a great combination here, especially if the enemy are dominating that high ground. If they give you the high ground for free, then the tank isn't as necessary. Now the last point is kind of 50-50 as well, but it doesn't as often feel super oppressive. Now if you're on the attacking side, you do have to remember that the enemy team have a much better spawn advantage now at this third point. You need to treat this point a lot like King's Row last, where you need clean regroups and you need clean ult engagements as well. Now this does have a little bit of an advantage where Tracers can actually flank around the back a lot easier than they can on Kings, because you can go all the way around that horrible pit that I'm sure you've fell or been booped into at some point, and then attack the enemy from behind, giving them some pretty horrible situations to deal with when the payload's being pushed on one side and the Tracer has easy access to your support line on the right hand side. Now I think on this point, more often than not, you're going to find yourself not being able to push the payload all the way to the end, and it's because of what I just said. The enemy team spawns just there, right next to where the payload is going to go. So if you go in and get one pick, but they also get someone on your team, a 1-for-1 trade's not good enough. You have to treat last points like this like 2CP, a much more misunderstood game mode because of these same reasons. Second point, spawner's advantage is huge, and unless you get 3 picks to the one that they get on your team, you're likely going to lose out, especially if the fight extends, because as soon as their respawn guy is back and on the cart, yours isn't even pushing out of his spawn yet and down the ramp to the cart. He's probably going to be another 5 or 10 seconds, and that's never enough. Big ult wipes like Zarya Graviton are huge on this point, and it plays like King's Row in the way that Reinhardt and Zarya are very good picks here. It prevents these long lines of sight from being usable by the enemy team, it allows you to approach the cart quicker, and it also gives you much better brawling potential when the enemy teams do trickle out spawn. When you do get a couple of picks and they start coming out and stalling, having that Reinhardt on the point is really powerful here. Now of course, Winston and D.Va are the best 2 tank combo in the entire game. You can run this here as well, but map geometry is important. King's Row is one of the only maps where Reinhardt is good, and Blizzardworld is probably a close second or third to that. Really, really good for him because it's so brawly, it's so tight and claustrophobic, and Junkrat is good on attack and on defense here for them same reasons. You just need to make sure you get them clean regroups and don't trickle in forever like 2CP, because that's what this last point is. So if you ever struggle on 2CP as well, just a general tip for you guys, it's the same case. You have to take the ground. Now there's no high ground to take here like you would take on Hanamura. You would go up top on Hanamura, put your soldier up there, and then go to the point and let him frag out. This is a little bit different to that. You're going to want to take the cart, push the cart through, and then have a ranged DPS either behind you or a pesky flanker on the back line. I think Tracer is kind of a must pick on this point because she's really, really powerful with the way that she can use the geometry, because Junkrat can't just lane down on this point all of the time. He's strong on defense, but there's definitely more counters to it. Finally, on this point, I'd say you probably want to be a little bit more strict about the heroes that you play. Reinhardt and Zarya are super powerful, or Reinhardt and D.Va. I do think the Rein's really good here to be able to walk the payload through the choke and have all kinds of different advantages over your enemies. Winston and D.Va are very strong, but because it's much easier for the enemy team to bunker up with their own Junkrat, Reinhardt, or even Orisa here, you could see some problems running just the dive tanks, especially with that spawn advantage. As for DPS and healers, it's just the general rules that apply really. If you're running dive, make sure you've got healers that can heal it, and if you can stay alive, putting a flanker behind the enemy here is going to cause them a lot of problems. On both sides, on most points of this map, make sure you regroup and make sure you win the fight before you push the objective, and you'll see a lot more success. So guys, let us know what you think. Did this help you out? And if there's anything you missed, be sure to let us know in the comment section down below. Be sure to drop a like, as it really does help us out and lets us know that you're enjoying the content, and you're going to want to hit that bell icon so that you get notified when our videos go live. Be sure to have a great day as always. Take care and peace, people.